harmony. The beautiful thing about Aave is that it's completely open source, decentralized, and governed by its community, enabling a truly bankless future for us all. To get your first crypto collateralized loan, get started at aave.com. That's AAVE.com. And also check out the Aave protocol governance forums to see what more than 100,000 DAO members are all raving about at governance.aave.com. I want to ask a question, and this is a little bit beyond my technical expertise to really understand. But if we have this world of like soulbound NFTs, and that's leaking all of this data that we don't want leaked, but we have the solutions to stop those leaks from being leaked with a combination of encryption and ZK proofs. If we maximize if we plug up all the holes of the leaking of the data with ZK proofs and encryption, do we actually kind of ultimately just work back down to the same properties of off-chain NFTs in the first place? Or off-chain credentials, I mean.
The key property that we keep, right, is this, I think, one, this ability to prove negatives, and which I do think is important. I think just to kind of expand on why I think like proving negatives is important, like I think it is definitely true that there are like negative or things that people have where if they get revealed, then those properties can get used against them. And I do think that like there's a really big and important role for privacy to play in kind of fighting against that. And I think even the crypto space itself is like a really good example of that, right? And lately we've been having more and more of these anons on Twitter, and they can just get kind of respected for who they are as anons, and we don't even necessarily needs to know what their faces look like, and unless and until they show them, right? And I think that's like people having the option to do that is beautiful. But at the same time, I think kind of the two caveats I would give there is one, that there is a way in which proving negatives can be kind of more, even more egalitarian and empowering than having to prove positives in some cases. And like one particular example of this, right, is in the real world, like in the non-crypto world, there are applications where like one side needs to know that the other side is at least reasonably trustworthy. And one thing that they might do is like prove that the other side doesn't have a criminal record, right? And that's nice because it's like a very simple test that someone is like at least not in, the bottom kind of a few percent of trustworthiness, kind of probably. And it's something that like most people have by default, right? Now, if we did not have the ability to prove the absence of a criminal record, then the thing that people would probably be forced to do instead is they would be forced to basically say you have to provide positive evidence of good character. And once you have to find positive evidence of good character, then like that's going to be something that's harder for people to find, right? Like some, just person who just has some stall on the street where she's been selling bananas for $1 for 25 years, like never did anything wrong, trustworthy, but just because she's not part of the system, she might not even have that evidence of good character, right? So I think like that's one important sense in which kind of like lack of negatives can be a more egalitarian thing than presence of positives. And also presence of there are a lot of cases even today where presence of positives is something that can be used to exclude, right? Even a simple one is like just requiring proof of citizenships, right? Like a developed country passport, something that 86% of people in the world don't have. I think, crypto really tries and cares about being global. That's, even a system that, even if you create a system that just allows checking that, then you're already allowing for the possibility of excluding people on that basis, right? So I think my general kind of view on this is that I don't think you really can kind of finally kind of target properties just by making it possible to prove positives and not possible to prove negatives. I think it's I think the to what extent a system is going to have the good outcomes and not going to have the bad outcomes is going to be based on these kind of much more kind of finely grained and detailed economic properties. And I think in probably both kinds of systems, there's like a utopia way to do it and a dystopia way to do it.
Well, Vitalik, I'm really glad that you brought up inclusion, because, as much as we would like for it to be the case, right, the Ethereum does not provide the only API of data about people on the planet. And so if we want to be able to make utterances that are relevant to people who use websites and email addresses and Solana and Bitcoin, we are going to need tools that allow us to communicate with the keys that they already have, as opposed to requiring the exclusionary need for them to hold the keys that we prefer to interact with our chosen system. That said, I also think that there's a really there's a prioritization opportunity for us here. Which problems are most urgent for us to pursue, right? Which need the most love right now? And so I think that there is a robust set of these opportunities where we might explore positive reputation, in terms of enabling better governance, as you were suggesting, right? For every community of well-meaning members, there's one Brantley. And so I think to the extent that we might think about, how reputation positively can impact the systems that we have today to unblock us immediately, I think that's a really great place for us to start focusing our effort while we studiously and collaboratively define, what is the identity system that's going to work for everybody. So I mentioned earlier, Kim Cameron's laws of identity that set forth a sort of industry standard framework for identity systems that minimize risk and harm to people. And I think there are a few of these things that I want to pull out that I think are relevant for us to discuss here today. I think user control and consent, as I mentioned earlier, is a core pillar, right? Just like how World of Warcraft loot screens, allow players to consent to put something in their inventory, even if it's non-transferable afterwards. In these systems, and in systems that are intended to minimize risk and harm to people, users should consent to those data interactions. And that may mean also consenting to participate in a system that involves negative reputation, right? We participate in the society, therefore we are subject to certain facets of our state. Pluralism of operators and technologies is sort of agreed upon element of a strong foundation for a global identity system that does not bring harm. So we avoid a monolithic solution. And minimal disclosure, as we talked about before, so you can share data with a minimum number of parties required. It's on a need-to-know basis, and this is kind of at odds with the 24/7 data availability that we've come to get used to in Web 2, where apps have 24/7 access to our information. And so I think that, this is a really wonderful opportunity, as I mentioned, for us to explore, what are the relative merits of these tools based on the needs that we have as humans, and how do we find that spectrum of use cases, Vitalik, as you suggested earlier, where some are more optimal than others, and we have a pretty good understanding of what we think those first externalities are going to be.
So I think, first of all, I definitely totally sympathize with the goal of technology neutrality. I think, if someone hates or just does not want to use Ethereum, or then they should not be forced to use it in order to be part of the identity web of the future. I think they should totally be able to use Solana. If you're David Gerard, then you should totally be free to kind of not bother with a blockchain at all and just have your open ID and let Google or Facebook run your identity. I think if someone wants to do that, that's fine too. And I do think that it is possible to create standards that cover that. I know that, for example, Juan from Filecoin, right? He is, in IPFS, there's a lot of work that's been done, and being able to kind of support multiple types of hash functions and support multiple algorithms for pretty much everything, and creating kind of these data standards that can actually do that. And I think it should, totally be possible. I don't, I'm not deep enough in the verifiable credential community to know maybe this already has been done. But to make it so that you can have an Ethereum account that interfaces with the system, or a Solana account, or
yes,
a
Vitalik,
Google
you can. We can.
Okay.
We can, sorry to jump in. We can do that. We can use a verifiable credential to bidirectionally bind together our Ethereum address with our Bitcoin address, with our Solana address. I can send a credential signed by my Ethereum address to someone else's address that is a Bitcoin address or a Solana address, and we can be on the same page already. So I would love to explore this more with you.
Okay, actually, so one kind of detailed question there. Let's say I want my, let's I'll jump to another team just for fun. Let's say I'm a Solana maxi and I want my Solana address to be my root, right? So with basically, does the system give the possibility for me to say the Solana address is my root, and the Solana address is the thing that has the right to kind of reset my Ethereum address and my Bitcoin address and the address and the public key that I use to send all the other attestations?
So we are currently working on that approach, starting with Ethereum keys at Disco. But our friends over at Encore in the Solana ecosystem are thinking about what that means for their world. So we'll keep you posted on what those discoveries look like. But we think, it's an exciting opportunity to become your first personal, you are your own multi-sig. You are your personal API. And so that means incorporating multiple facets of your personhood.
So I was trying to keep up with that, and so I think what you guys were talking about, if with the root conversation, is that with these off-chain verifiable credentials, off-chain decentralized identifiers, I just spun up my Disco data loot bag yesterday. But does that mean that, Evan, Disco is opinionated, as in Disco's home is Ethereum, even though it can link to other Ethereum addresses? Is that the conversation that you guys are having?
So we are building, starting in the Ethereum ecosystem, because that is where we have the most experience and we see the most exciting opportunities, of course. And so as we explore the relationships that people have between different keys, we're going to figure out, what does it look like? Is it hierarchical? Right now, based on the decentralized identifier spec, not especially, but identity is an emergent thing. And so I think based on the way that people start to interact, deliberately engaging multiple chains at once, or their physical space with their on-chain activities, or even Web2 activities, we'll start to see more of this structure emerge. So at Disco, the very first thing that we're doing is enabling everybody to create decentralized identifiers out of their existing Ethereum addresses, so they can get so they can use their existing MetaMask keys to sign off-chain data in the form of verifiable credentials that they can write about themselves, they can send to their friends, they can receive from the DAOs in which they are members, like Boys Club or SheFi, DAOs and Syndicate and Seed Club as well in the future. And so we are starting off with the Ethereum ecosystem because, as Vitalik noted earlier, we are hitting a ceiling of fun that we can have together when we're limited to on-chain data.
And so, Vitalik, what can you illustrate or illuminate the importance of trying to have an agnostic technology that, if somebody wants to have what I think you guys called the root not be Ethereum, if Ethereum isn't your main chain of choice, why is that an important choice for users?
I think it is looking like we're going to be in a world where different users are kind of primarily homed on one particular chain, and I think that's totally fine. And in some cases, the chains that people use might even end up changing. So I'd say, in general, if you have a standard of this type that ends up kind of enshrining one particular chain, then that both, obviously it entrenches that standard further in that chain's ecosystem, but it does also kind of limit the social scalability of it, which I think is from that point of view something that's totally fair.
Evan, is this technology that what you're building at Disco, is this agnostic from even necessarily the cryptocurrency world? I know it will always use cryptography, but is this something that the Web2 world can leverage?
Absolutely, yes. So in the same way that we can create a decentralized identifier out of our Ethereum address, we could also create one out of a PGP key, an email address, a website. And so our ability to show up with the various facets that make us us, and connect them together is one thing, right? Which names are we using for ourselves? Where do they come from? But our ability to collect metadata around all those different names, off-chain, non-financial metadata in the form of credentials describing any of those addresses, this has very little to do with, or natively has very little to do with financial interactions. The security of data in this particular form is secured by cryptography, as you note. And so though off-chain credentials can support the integrity and transparency and complexity of financial interactions, there is nothing inherently financial about them. So when I send a verifiable credential to you, I don't pay any fees or anything, but because it's a piece of data, it's got to be stored somewhere. So we're sort of changing the process of where cost falls in that communication.
So I have two last questions before I run out of them. And so if there's any last subjects floating around in your respective brains, do bring them up. But my last question is about like a superset versus a subset of these different like form factors. And what I mean by that is, and Vitalik, correct me if I'm wrong, but like this isn't like soul-bound NFTs versus off-chain identifiers. Like in my understanding for this is that like a soul-bound NFT is like a smaller subset of just like verifiable credentials and decentralized identifiers at large, right? Where you have a verifiable credential, and then if you imbue that into an NFT on a blockchain and make that NFT non-transferable, then you get a soul-bound NFT. Vitalik, would you agree with that description?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like important to distinguish between like verifiable credentials, the brand's name, kind of, and the kind of specific community that's been working around that brand name for a half a decade, versus the general concept of credentials that are verifiable. Soulbound NFTs are credentials that are verifiable. But on the other, a soulbound NFT is also a brand name, right? Because soulbound NFT is, by some definitions, they're not even tokens. So it's like I think once you kind of go beyond the kind of like the specific kind of categories that exist in people's heads and like start thinking about properties, like you can totally unlock that entire space in the middle, right? And like I think just even to save gas, it does totally make sense in a lot of cases to, make popes be off-chain in a lot of contexts, for example, right? Like, if you have a pope issuer, then like they can save gas by just issuing an entire tree of popes and just staking the root on chain, and then giving every individual participant the Merkle branch, right? And if you trust the pope issuer to issue a legitimate pope, then you're going to trust the pope issuer for data availability anyway, so that's fine, right? So that already kind of is an opportunity to save a whole bunch of gas, though you do still kind of retain some properties of a blockchain, like you've like, just for example, you retain this kind of hard kind of like proof that says that like if your Merkle branch has length 10, then you can prove that a maximum of 1,024 of them have been issued, right? And you can only do that sort of thing if you actually have Merkle branches going into a particular root and you have like that particular root committed on chain. So there's definitely is this kind of long spectrum of how much chaining are you doing, and how many more of these extra guarantees that you're getting. And I do think that different use cases are going to want different things along that spectrum, which I think is totally fine. I think another thing that's probably worth stressing is that I think one of the differences between cryptography and social systems is that a social system does not survive first contact with reality, right? Like the only way to make social systems that are sane just is going to have to involve like some degree of being iterative and like kind of setting it out there, seeing how people interact with it, and then kind of using those experiences as feedback into the next version, right? Like I think we saw a lot of that with Gitcoin, for example, and the Gitcoin grants rounds, and how they've kind of matured from the very kind of early versions that we saw during like rounds 1 to 3 into the very mature community that we see today. And so I think ultimately like the people that probably both can and will kind of make the biggest difference here probably are not even just going to be people kind of passively thinking about this. It actually will be people who wants to issue specific popes for a particular purpose, or people who wants to issue soul-bound airdrops and have particular needs for what kinds of properties that they're trying to filter for, or people who wants to let's say make some social media platform that has like some built-in form of ZK negative reputation and like trying to get privacy and accountability at the same time. So I think the use cases themselves are going to kind of like matter a lot, and so I mean, in some ways, I even think that kind of the missing fourth person in this chat might even be someone from kind of one of these like applications that's actually been using their credentials or pokes or proof community. But I'm very hopeful that I think those people are aware of the discussion, they're part of the discussion, and I think we're going to have lots of opportunities to talk and figure it out.
Yeah, on the weekly roll-up that Ryan and I recorded yesterday, it came out today. For the people that are listening to this coming Wednesday, it was last Friday. There was a question from the nation that we answered, which is like, what is the big next thing that is coming to the world of crypto? And Ryan and I both independently came up with the same answer, which is more or less the conversation that we're having right now, which is identity. And how can we get more expressive identity as a utility inside of the crypto ecosystem? And so I think this conversation, Vitalik, is going to be very much ongoing as it progresses in pure crypto fashion, which is in all directions at once. Evan, any comments or topics you want to bring up before I ask my last question?
David, to the point of all directions at once, I think we have this very unique opportunity to bring a ton of camps together that haven't yet been before. We have a way to use our Ethereum addresses to communicate globally, off-chain, private, trustless reputation. And today, 5-year-old students are accruing verifiable credentials around their decentralized identifiers as they learn with the Lego Foundation, as well as students at Harvard, which co-founded the Digital Credentials Consortium, which makes it easy for universities to issue verifiable credentials for academic achievements. So from 5-year-olds to cryptography PhDs at Harvard, we have an incredible community of folks who we can reach out to with this conversation, who we can bring into the fold, who we can onboard to their first MetaMask addresses, and we can invite them to the table as we continue this.
So to put this just in really just concrete language, and I know like whether or not it should be a credential should be off-chain and have the data off-chain, or if it should be a soul-bound on-chain NFT, is definitely going to depend on the facts and circumstances of the actual context of whatever we're talking about. But I'll bring up which is like one very simple one, which is like my college degree. So the question is, what is the best like form factor for like a university higher education degree? And so what a degree is, it's a piece of paper that is basically a credential of being proficient in a specific domain of knowledge. So like when Harvard enters the metaverse, what's like the most logical form factor for them to issue credentials? Evan, I'll throw that one to you.
So I feel like I kind of, blew up the lead a little bit there because I realized I just mentioned Harvard to work with verifiable credentials. But if we were to take a step back, pretend that we don't know that, I think soul-bound tokens are not as flexible and well-suited as verifiable credentials, specifically for college degrees. So, in addition to adhering to some of those principles we talked around, the laws of identity, user control and consent, awesome with verifiable credentials, same with, pluralism of technologies that can interact with it and minimal disclosure. But verifiable credentials, in addition to enabling this privacy and self-custody, also allow us to reconcile rich semantic mapping work among, all these kinds of different people in the educational space. So we can establish equivalence from one learning outcome, like one class, to another. Because I can choose how to share my diploma. Additional information, like we talked about earlier in the conversation, isn't going to get leaked, such as when it was issued, which might indicate my age. But more importantly, the same vehicle, these verifiable credentials, can be used for formal claims. So, sensitive formal claims like a transcript, what grades did you get, or less sensitive things like a diploma. And finer grained claims that can be composed into a richer view with all of these together kind of in a presentation, things like your grades on a homework assignment, as well as informal claims like being the best speller in the class. And I think this is really important in the educational space when it comes to reducing gatekeeping and improving opportunities for all kinds of students, because we still have basic problems like, you don't get any credit for college education until you finish everything. So verifiable credentials can enable scenarios like reverse transfers, for example, where you can get tangible credit in the form of an associate's degree for courses that you've already completed, which can lead to some real opportunities. And as I mentioned a little bit ago, students as young as 5 years old are already earning verifiable credentials in the Super Skills app from Lego. And just this week on Monday, there's an interoperability hackathon from the World Wide Web Consortium with 25 different wallets participating, which is part of why I think there's so much enthusiasm in the higher education space. But as long as the world is larger than Ethereum, then credentials will exist outside and inside Ethereum. And because, as far as I understand, soulbound tokens do not have a defined spec yet, we can't commit to what soulbound tokens look like on all chains at this time. Whereas verifiable credentials are already interoperable with more than 90 different kinds of keys, including Ethereum. So we can use our Ethereum keys and lightly enable other existing issuers to deploy some minimally invasive tools and unlock, I think, a majority of use cases, including the educational one here.
No, the college degree use case is interesting. There is actually already is a company based out of Singapore called OpenCerts that has been doing kind of blockchain-based certificates for like on Ethereum for a couple of years now. Their approach is this kind of interesting hybrid approach, right, where a degree by itself is basically just a signed message. So it's a verifiable credential, though it doesn't follow the verifiable credentials TM spec probably. But like if they have to revoke it, or if they have to make a correction, or if they have to do kind of any one of those kind of prove a negative type things, then it's a blockchain message.
I would say, I am aware of their work. I think it's, it's interesting, it's valid. It definitely does not align as strongly with the verifiable credentials for education working group from the World Wide Web Consortium that's been around for quite a few years and is working with dozens, I think probably at this point, hundreds of educational institutions. So we have abilities to put these things on and off chain. But if we look to where the energy in the market is in terms of realistic adoption, I think, verifiable credentials are doing a really great job of bringing value to these campus communities.
Mm-hmm.
So Vitalik, if you were Harvard, how would you issue a degree?
I mean, I think, just use any of these things. Like, I think it's, in some ways, like, the differences aren't even that large, right? Because, like, if you make one thing, you can just import a cryptographic proof of it into another medium anyway. Possibly even just do both, right? Like, it's like, why not do both, and kind of encourage people to build applications that can like work with both formats.
So zooming out here, guys, for the last and final question, say we go into the world of the late 20s of crypto, and we've solved all of these like problems with getting identity expressed in ways that have strong assurances, and it's just more expressive about who we are as people to go into the world of Web3. What about that world where we have successfully leveraged identity in non-dystopian ways in the world of crypto?